Right, so what I said, we're going to look at the whole book in one go, and then I've got a wee video at the end that's a bit like one of the videos we've seen before from the Bible Project on, they do book overviews, which are really, really helpful. They're extremely helpful, and they do a much better job at giving the overview than me, but I'll point out some key verses, but that'll sort of help tie it up. So, Esther. Chapter 1, we are in a very unique book. It's one of the very few books, like I said on Sunday, where God isn't mentioned. There aren't many of the books in the Bible where God isn't mentioned, but this is one of them. But at the same time, it's about his people and how God works behind the scenes. And it's set in a place called Susa. You'll see that in the first couple of verses there. Susa is a place in Persia. Pardon me, and it's set after the exile. Now, let me give you a quick overview of what's happening. God's people, the Israelites, they settle in Jerusalem, and they have the land there. God warns them time and time again, if you start to take your eyes off me and start worshiping other gods, there'll be punishment. I'm going to bring destruction to you. And the punishment was in the form of exile. They were going to be kicked out of their land because the land was so important to them. One of the big things in the Old Testament is land. Think of the promised land and Jerusalem and Canaan and all that. So the punishment is exile. I'm going to kick you out. If you stop looking to me, if you start looking towards other gods and doing what the other nations do, I'm going to kick you out. And of course, they don't listen and they get kicked out and they're in exile. And if you think of the book of Daniel, Daniel is a prophet in Babylon during the time of exile. So the Babylonians come and they kick, so the nation's divided in two, but they kick the southern half, I think, out. And Daniel and some Jews are in Babylon, worshipping the Lord, trying to serve the Lord in exile in a different place because they're under captivity. The Babylonians came in, the Assyrians came in the north, and they kicked the people out and drag a whole pile of them captive and wreck the whole place as punishment from the Lord. So Daniel is in a sense one of those books where it's in the middle of exile. What happens then is after a while they are allowed to return back to the land and sort of rebuild things. And you see Ezra and Nehemiah, they sort of rebuild the temple and the walls of Jerusalem. Not everyone returns. There are some people who remain behind, and these are who we're talking about here in the book of Esther. Esther and some of her people, the Jews, are living in this place called Susa in Persia after the exile. Okay, so that's the background. So they're in a pagan country. They're in a country that's not their own, but they're also Jews trying to serve the Lord in that place. Okay, with me so far? Good. Don't fall asleep yet. I know it's hot in here. Don't fall asleep just yet. So there's a king called Xerxes. If you look at verse 1, there's a king called Xerxes on the throne, and he throws a big party. Look at verse 3. There's a lot of drinking, by the way, in Esther. In the third year of Xerxes' reign, he gave a banquet, verse 3, for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media and the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. And this party went on for ages. And after a while, King Xerxes wants to show off his wife because she's a very pretty woman and he wants to parade her around for all to see. So look at verses 10 to 12. On the seventh day, when King Xerxes was high in spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, and there are their names if you want to read them yourselves, commanded them to bring before him Queen Vashti, that's his wife, wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and the nobles, for she was lovely to look at. So she's a stunning woman. And he wants to display her in front of everyone because he's so wasted with wine. He's like, half cut, saying, hey, I'll bring my wife out and you can all have a look at her. Verse 12, though, when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come, and the king became furious and burned with anger. Okay, so that's chapter 1. That's pretty much chapter 1. King has a party. He gets wasted with wine. He wants to display his wife, and she refuses, and he's burning with anger. Chapter 2, then, we're introduced to this girl called Esther. And the king is still livid about Vashti and what he's done. So the men suggest that he holds a beauty pageant. Look at verse 2 of Esther 2. The king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. So there's a man called Mordecai, and he's cousins with Esther. They're both Jews, part of the Jewish community. And Esther is stunning as well. She's a beautiful woman. And Mordecai suggests that she enters the beauty pageant. But she's to keep her Jewishness secret. Just don't mention that you're a Jew. And the chapter 2 describes her getting ready for this beauty pageant. And when she comes before the king, he is smitten. Look at verse 17 of chapter 2. The king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So Esther's made queen. Instead of Vashti, she's been kicked to the curb now. Esther is now the most beautiful woman in the land. Now the queen to the king of Persia. So we have a Jew. He doesn't know this. We have a Jew now in a place of influence. A bit like Joseph in the story of Joseph. There's a parallel there. He's a Jew or Hebrew, whatever, in a place of foreign land, in a place of power to cause influence. So here we have the sort of the female version of Joseph in this. But chapter 2 is interesting, and chapter 2 is a kind of a key point. It closes with Mordecai hearing of a plot to assassinate the king. So look at verses 21 to 23 here in Esther 2. During that time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, and two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, his cousin, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. So Esther goes to the king and says, this guy Mordecai has heard of a plot to assassinate you. Verse 23, when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles, and all this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. So they minuted what happened. This is a key point. They minuted what happened here, okay? So Esther reports this plot to the king, gives credit to Mordecai, and it's brought to his attention. These two people are impaled on poles. So that's the end of chapter 2. In chapter 3 now we're introduced to a villain in the story, a man called Haman. And Haman was proud, and he wanted people to bow to him. Whenever he walks in the door, he wanted people to bow to him and worship him. Mordecai wouldn't do that. Look at verse 5 and 6 of Esther chapter 3. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, Haman was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he learned that they were Jews, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. So Mordecai won't bow down to Haman. And he's raging with Mordecai, but not just that. He finds out that he's a Jew, so he says, you know what, I'm going to wipe out all the Jews. He's so enraged with Mordecai, okay? Haman's not only mad with Mordecai, he wants to wipe out the Jews. Now don't forget, Esther is a Jew as well. So he brings this idea to the king about killing all the Jews. The king doesn't realize that Esther's a Jew. So look at verses 3 to 11. The king took, verses 10 to 11 of chapter 3. The king took his signet ring from his finger, gave it to Haman, son of that guy, the enemy of the Jews. Keep your money, the king said to Haman, and do with the people as you please. And then Haman throws some dice to determine when the Jews will be wiped out, and their fate is set. The Jews are going to be killed by this guy called Haman. Okay? In chapter 4, Esther decides to help Mordecai and the Jews. And we have a key section of the narrative which kind of explains the whole book. If you were to get one verse that summed up the whole book, it's in chapter 4. Okay? Mordecai says to Esther, maybe this whole thing, this whole beauty contest and Vashti not wanting to go in and the fact that you're now queen, maybe this is why you are in this position of power. Maybe God's brought all of this to happen so that you're in the exact place to influence the person that can save God's people. Look at verse 14. Mordecai says, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Maybe you're in this position exactly for this reason. That's your key verse there, okay? That's your key verse to sum up the whole of Esther. Maybe you've come to this position for such a time as this. Esther has to bring it to the king, but to go into the king's presence without being summoned, that's not good. You can get killed for that. But Esther's brave. Esther says, go gather all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days or 3 nights. And I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. What bravery there for the queen. If I perish, I perish. If I get killed for this, so be it. Then, chapter 5. Esther arranges a banquet for the queen. Here's more drinking, you see. And Esther arranges a banquet for the king and Haman. But she doesn't tell the king about Haman's plans to kill the Jews at this first banquet. She just says, I'm going to have another banquet. So she arranges a banquet. The king and Haman are there. And she says, I'm going to have another banquet for you. Come again tomorrow or another time and we'll have another banquet. Haman leaves the banquet and he sees Mordecai. And he's raging because he sees Mordecai again. It reminds him of all the hatred that he has. And he's enraged and he goes back to his wife. Look at verse 9 of chapter 5. Haman went out that day, happy and in high spirits. Of course, he's wasted again. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. And if you read on later on, Haman goes back to his wife at the very end of the chapter. He's all annoyed, and she says to Haman, why not build gallows or put a stake in the ground and hang Mordecai from it? Why did you kill this guy? Why did you impale him on a pole? So Haman gets this arranged. He gets people to go and make a big pole to hang Mordecai on this pole. So you're with me so far? Let me recap. Esther, the Jew, is now queen to King Xerxes. Her cousin Mordecai has heard about this plot to assassinate the king. She's brought it to the king and said, Mordecai noticed this, and it was written down. But Haman doesn't like Mordecai. He wants to kill Mordecai and the Jews. And so that has been set in stone. Their fate is set. But Haman sees Mordecai and he's going to get him impaled on this pole. Chapter 6, though, I think, is gold. It's absolutely gold the way this has happened. King Xerxes can't sleep. So he has the minute book brought to him. Something I should do, I think, when I can't sleep, and bring the session minutes to me. Don't forget, what was minuted before? Mordecai's telling Esther to tell him about the assassination plot. So he reads about Mordecai and the assassination plot, and he asks, has this guy got any reward for this? What honor has this man got? He hasn't got any honor. At that time, Haman comes in. And the king's like, just the man. And he says look at verse 6. When Haman entered, the king asked Haman, now the king's talking about Mordecai. But he says, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Because he wants to honor Mordecai for this assassination plot. And look at verse 6 again. Now Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So Haman thinks that the king wants to honor Haman. But he wants to honor Mordecai, his nemesis. And if you read on there, Haman lists a load of things because he thinks that he's going to be honored. So he lists a load of things that should be done to him, thinking it would be him that would be honored. Dressed like a king, let them be led on throughout the land on the horse so that they can be worshipped. And then the king says to Haman, great idea. Go you and get Mordecai and lead him on a horse with a robe on through the city. Look at verse 10, chapter 6. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything that you have recommended. So Haman, verse 11, had to get the robe and the horse, and he rode Mordecai, and he led him on horseback through the city claims, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Well, it's amazing, isn't it? Chapter 7 then. Haman and the king are in the second banquet that Esther provides, and she reveals the plot that Haman has made to kill Esther's people, the Jews. Look at verse 4. She says, for I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing? Who is this person who's decided to kill you and all the Jews? Esther said, an adversary and enemy, this vile Haman who's sitting right there. And Haman is terrified, verse 6, before the king and the queen. So she outs Haman. He's the guy who's going to do this. The king is raging. He leaves the banquet. And in the meantime, Haman begs for his life to Esther. The king comes back into the banquet and he sees Haman begging for his life, and he thinks that Haman's trying to assault Esther. Verse 8, look at verse 8 of chapter 7. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining, and the king exclaimed, will he even molest the queen while she is with me in this house? As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, get this, look at verse 9, brilliant. Harbona said, there's a pole reaching to the height of 50 cubits that stands by Haman's house. The pole that Haman asked to set up to impale Mordecai. Verse 9, a pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. And the king said, impale him on it. So they impaled, verse 10, they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. The king's fury subsided. What a twist. Isn't that amazing? Chapter 8, Esther asks for the king to reverse his decree to kill the Jews, but apparently once you've made a decree, you can't reverse it. So they make another decree that the Jews can defend themselves. And Mordecai is honored too. If you look at verse 15, when Mordecai left the king's presence, he was wearing royal garments of blue and white, and a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen, and the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. And then chapter 9 details all the people that the Jews kill in defense of themselves. And then chapter 10 ends with only 3 verses. Look at the last verse. Verse 3. Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, prominent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. I'm going to show you the video here, and you'll see how the story is laid out because I do it graphically, and it's easier to maybe to get it in your head. You'll see how the start and the end are connected, a bit like Jonah chapter 1 that we saw on Sunday. We'll see where the middle of the pyramid is, the main point, the turning point. But the whole book serves as a reminder that God is working behind the scenes in everything in our lives. Like, you might not see it. God isn't mentioned here, so you might not even realize that God is working away. But he is. And some of the strangest things that might happen to you are happening for a reason. And they could be the Lord putting us in a position for a certain reason, for such a time as this. which I think is fascinating. It's a good reminder and comfort of the things that happen in our lives and the things that will, whatever happens, that rise to whatever position you might have in your in job or career, whatever it is, or things that happen. It could be the Lord just putting you in that position. So trust that even though you may not see His working, He's working behind the scenes all the time. Let's have a look at the video, and then we'll take any comments.